If you want to mix drums flawlessly, you have to start with how you set up your drum mix. For me, there are 3 steps you cannot ignore, but before we go there, I have to give credit. Yesterday, before I took my son to school, I listened to Ed Thorne's mix for Another Love Song, and it was awesome. The drums sounded great, and it inspired me to make this video. So go check it out and support Ed on his YouTube channel because he did an incredible job. Now, here are the drums I'm working with for Another Love Song. Step 1, we need to phase align the drums. Some people align to the kick, some people align to the snare, but I don't like either of those ways. I learned from Craig Bow to phase align to the overhead left mics, and after doing this for about a year, I figured out why this works so well. The left overhead is the most equidistant sound source to both the kick and the snare. That's the first reason. The second reason is the overheads contain all the sustain and tonality of the drums. So when you're adjusting the kick and snare levels in the mix, you don't want to blend either one to be out of phase with the overheads because it will change the tone of the drum mix. So if you were to phase align to the kick drum, then when you go to move your snare, it's going to change the timbre of the snare in relation to the overheads. And vice versa, if you align everything to the snare drum, when you boost the kick, it's going to change the sound of the kick coming through the overheads because those two sources weren't locked in at the start. Left overhead is the basis, the right overhead gets aligned to that, the kick out gets aligned to that, the snare top gets aligned to that, the kick out and the snare top gets sent out, and then the kick in gets aligned to the kick out. The kick samples get aligned to the kick out. The snare bottom gets aligned to the snare top. The snare samples get aligned to the snare top. The hi-hats on the left side, so it gets assigned to the overhead left. The toms on the left gets assigned to the overhead left. Toms on the right, overhead right. And let's actually have a listen to all these channels with and without the alignment. It's subtle, but the low end is a little bit bigger. The snare's a little bit snappier, a bit brighter actually. I prefer the warmer snare, but the snap and definition is something a little bit more desired because I can add warmth later. But everything is punchy. Not that the drums are recorded badly or they weren't good to begin with, but just this subtle change at the start gives me a lot to play with because now I know that my kick and snares are aligned to my overhead. So as I change the level of the kick and snares, it's not going to shift the tone of the overheads. Now, step 2, get the overall balance of the drums. Now, I always mix drums top down, so any processing I must do must be done on a global level to start with. Joe Glider actually has a great series on top-down mixing, and I actually left my thoughts in a comment the other day on his latest video, which I thought I'd share here too. The phase relationship of the sum difference between channels remain intact the further or more global you apply the processing. And let's say you add an EQ shelf on the mix bus. The phase rotation moves universally across the sum signal. Let's say you put an EQ shelf on the drum bus. The phase rotation moves universally across the drum bus. The phase shift and summing of adjacent signals, it might be a bass, it might be another sort of guitar hit on the snare, and adjacent signals may be changed in their tone because of the relative summing of those multiple signals. Now let's go micro and you do an EQ shelf on the kick drum. The phase rotation of that single EQ move shifts the relative sum difference of the kick to all the adjacent mics, and that shifts the sum sound of the drums. Now that doesn't mean we don't do individual processing on the drums. It just means we do not do it first. We build with our big building blocks first. My aim here is to create a balance of the overheads going through the drum bus that resembles the full mix. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but the reason being is everything else, the kick drum mics, the snare drum mics, all the other mics that feed into the drum bus is to simply embellish and fill out the details. And we can get a bit more nitty gritty and start gating them. That can happen later on. But at the start, I just want to get everything feeding in so we get a nice natural drum sound, which we can carve away easily later on. I'm liking that sound. I don't want to go too heavy boosting the low end because we've got other mics that are going to feed into that. But overall, that's a very neutral drum sound that we can work with, that we can blend into in a really nice way. Take a listen to that without the kick mics and with the kick mics. Now let's do the snares. Do you hear that ringing in the snare? Now, we're not going to go into the snare channel to EQ this. Remember, we're going top down. That's part of the science of mixing drums, is that you've got all these drum mics to manage all these phase relationships, top down, Pro Q3. All right, and we'll get this ringing pretty easily, actually. Thankfully, Pro Q3 is good at it. How good's that? To just get rid of it like that. We'll go before and after and listen to that ringing. It does thin out the snare, but we can fix that up later, and we will fix it up later. And we're still going to get the samples in because we've got another 2 snare samples here. Right, so let's get the rest of these room mics and kit mics going. All right, I'm pretty happy with that balance. What we're going to do is we're just going to level match this to the original one, which I recorded, and then we'll have a listen before and after. There are a few little issues that I'm hearing, namely these notches to get rid of the ringing. You're losing some of the fullness from that snare drum. And that brings us to our third step of this whole tutorial, and that is we phase align. We use top-down processing. So in terms of when we need to EQ globally. We start at the top here, and that's what we've set up here. And next is, before you start tweaking individual little elements or putting gates and other things, start with parallel processing to fill out the sound. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to do parallel processing on the kick, the snare, and the overall drum mix. We're going to send all the snares to the same parallel, process and gel them, and then blend this up. We're going to be pretty loud on the parallel because I just like to be super obtuse with the effect and then blend it back in. I like to use lo-fi because it adds even order harmonics. This is something Andrew Sheps does with his drums, but I just like to do it in parallel. And then we're going to use, again, the SSL channel strip here, and we're going to stuff with it a little bit. I don't know if we're going to use a gate, but we'll get a feel for it and we'll dial it in just right. It's interesting. All right, let's blend this in. We're going to start all the way at the bottom and just get it to where we're filling it out nicely. And before and after, we'll turn it off and then put it back in. This is why I like using parallel, because this is its own effect channel. The other mics and the other sound sources all stay in phase with one another. And then this single effect, this saturation, I can blend in and out and have more control over the phase relationship of all those sound sources because I haven't actually put that processing directly on the individual channel. That's the snare. Now let's do the kick. My aim with the kick drum is to give it a little bit of definition. So it goes right on the very top. The body's quite nice, but I just need a little bit more definition. That is like over the top, but it's for a particular reason. We're going to blend this in from the bottom. Again, when I do my parallel, it's a pretty simple process. Compress a lot, focus on a very specific frequency, crank it, compress a lot. That's at least mine. That's not the technical sort of thing that I recommend everybody do, but I'm doing it in parallel. So I'm not worried about warping the drum tone super far from something that's unrecognizable. This still sounds like a good natural drum recording. We go before where we started. Now, we need the kick, the snare, drum parallel, all right? Now, I don't like to send my kick there, all right? We're going to send our snares and all of our tom racks, yep, everything to, these are all going to this channel here. And I'm going to use a very specific processor with a specific setting. I use this quite a lot, actually. It's the end style in punish on number 2. What we're going to do is we're going to listen to how this is crushing pretty much. And then from that, actually we can maybe drop this down. Can we drop this down? Yeah, we can. I'm going to drop that down, the drum bus. So we just listen to the crunch version. We're going to mix the sends into the decapitator so we get a good blend. Now, what I'm listening for is if anything is poking a little bit too much into this decapitator, I'm going to bring it down slightly. Okay, bring the drum bus back up, and then we'll aim to blend this sort of distorted body back into it. The reason why I like this is because it gives a bit of grit and texture to all the sustain and tone without having to over compress that drum bus, because that drum bus is only doing a very little bit of compression, all right? So let's listen to these drums before and after. So that's my process for mixing drums. I make sure everything is aligned to a T, even if I've got a fully sampled drum in terms of a pop mix with lots of drum samples and snare samples. I'm making sure all those samples align with one another. That's step one, phase alignment. Step two is top down. So start with the drum bus. I don't typically work with drum buses when I'm mixing, but you start from that top tier. And when I'm using live drums, I start with the overheads, feeding the drum bus, getting an EQ balance on the overhead so they sound natural and open, and then using all the other elements to just feed and embellish. So that's step two. Step one, alignment. Step two, top down with the overheads to set the tone of the drum bus. Step three is where I feel there are gaps, I use parallel processing to fill out, okay? Once that's done, that is the setup, okay? I've got to do another video on the individual channels because there's a lot more that can be done to this, and a lot more that you can do when you're drum mixing, because you can gate the drums now without much consequence. You can do a lot of reverb and delays and other elements, distorting some of the snare drum, adding a bit of harmonics and grit. You can start now processing individual elements without a lot of consequence because the rest of it is set up so everything is phase aligned, everything is well balanced, the EQ on the main bus is fed into, so everything works together. It's one big harmony. And that's the great thing about when you set up a drum mix like this, you will not be chasing your tail. So I hope you liked this video. This was a little bit different because I was just inspired and I'm like, I've got to do something. So thank you to Ed Thorne for inspiring me to do this video. And until next time, take care.